Welcome back. Okay, so let's talk about anthropology and art. So, anthropologists oftentimes try and understand art within a given culture, which will help us to understand a little bit more about that community. What is it that they find to be so important, right? What do they find to be popular consumption, right? And what do you find to be sort of counterculture, right, or subculture? What is resistant or rebellious, and how does it get expressed, right? At one point, rock and roll music in America was rebellious, right? It was going against the grain. People were losing their minds over rock and roll. It was the gateway to hell, right? And rock and rollers sung about that. And it was a rebellious thing. Well, that rebellious thing became normal, right? Rock and roll is now normal. So we also have to understand the impact of time, right? Time will change things. Time will adapt to different different ways of viewing a community, and that's where we can look at sort of historical approaches to art, and then also contemporary art and how things are changing there. One thing I'll mention here is graffiti. Okay, because graffiti, if we go back, let's say 30 or 40 years, and take a look at what was going on with graffiti. Graffiti has been seen as villainous, right? As destructive and really not very good, right? And all of a sudden, over the last couple of decades, graffiti art has changed. And you see more and more of it. And when you watch my documentary, one of the things that the guys will point out is that at one point graffiti was used as a means of like staking out territory. Like, this is my territory, do not enter. And that was also done to the public. Like, hey, you people out there, don't come into my neighborhood. This is our neighborhood, right? And now, because graffiti's identity has changed, right? If you go downtown, you see all these like beautiful murals, right? Street art and wall art. And if you go down to Rhino, down along like Blake Street, you'll see all of these walls and businesses that have got these amazing murals, right? And fantastic pieces of art, right? They're beautiful. And every year we have the Orange Crush, which is this event that all these graffiti artists from all over the country and from other countries will come in, and they paint like 6 or 7 blocks worth of walls, right? And everybody gets their wall, and they all get together on this weekend, and it's all these artists doing this amazing stuff. We can do that now because graffiti has become normalized, right? It's become, instead of a negative thing, it's now becoming more and more of a positive thing. People are actually going around and asking business owners, hey, can I paint your wall? And they're like, yeah, totally, paint my wall. That would be great. Like, wow, And what's happening is that graffiti has been sort of consumerized. Have you ever, looked at a Mountain Dew commercial, right? Or a Mountain Dew can? It looks like graffiti, right? Or if you look at, here's an example right here. I'm not advertising for any particular type of iced tea or lemonade. But that right there, that's some aspect of graffiti, right? Some of those designs came from these artists that were out there doing their own thing, not getting paid for it, not getting, the attention, but still practicing their art. And that artwork has turned from being seen as a negative into much more of a positive. There's still a lot of issues around graffiti, and there's conflict even within the graffiti culture about whether or not you should do graffiti for money, right? That you should be commissioned to paint a wall, right? Part of the idea behind some of the original graffiti artists is that we're doing this, one, either to make a statement, or two, to make everyone else aware that I'm here, and this is my name, and I'm putting it everywhere so that everyone will recognize that my existence is here right now. So, how anthropologists can kind of look at what's going on in the art world, within a community's art world, and say, this might be a trend we're going to see in the future, right? Or this is something that is going to become an aspect of the past. I think a really interesting thing, and I heard this on the news today, it was a discussion on religion within the United States. And one of the things that is happening is that the United States is becoming more and more secular. And what that means is that people are starting to say that they are not religious, right? 30% of Americans say that they do not affiliate themselves with any particular religion. And that's a huge number. That is an absolutely huge number. Compared to about 30 years ago, when you would have had about 90% of Americans say that they were associated with any given church, any given religion, right? So that number is coming down at a strikingly alarming rate. And you could make an inference as to how the art world is going to change based off of that information. If you have a decrease in religious people that are attending churches, that are consuming religious material, what do you think that's going to do to the artwork as well? The craftsmanship that goes into making customized like crucifixes that you might wear as a necklace, or artwork that you might consume or like put in your house. A lot of that stuff is going to decrease as there is less demand for it. You're going to have less producers and less consumers. So you can expect, as this trend continues to process, if religion continues to become less and less of a popular thing in this country, you're going to find less and less artwork, less and less consumption of it. And that'll lead you to a trend. As an anthropologist, you're going to say, okay, in 20 years, this is what it might look like. This is might what happen, to this community. So that can be a really important thing to try and understand in a culture, right? What are the trends? How are things changing? Is there an increase or decrease in religious approach? Because religion has a huge impact on artwork and what is appropriate artwork, right? Again, rock and roll, right? Rock and roll versus, sort of the conservative idealism with religion. So, yeah, we can start to understand trends. We can start to see where people are heading. Um, let's see. We can also understand like what kind of a state that culture is in, right? Whether or not that community is a very stable community versus whether or not it is a fractured community. If we go into a community and we see the same art everywhere, right? Everyone's kind of got the same stuff. That's a really stable community, right? If there's not a lot of variation, if everyone's pretty much showing the same thing, then a lot of the ideals and a lot of the norms that people share are going to be similar, and that means that there's not going to be a lot of conflict within that community. So as you're looking at artwork, it's going to give you an indicator as to what's happening in that community. Vice versa, if you're in a country like the United States that is highly diverse when it comes to its ideals and its identity, we're going to see artwork that depicts all kinds of stuff, right? From the subversive to the affirmative, that's going to say this is our culture and we need more of this, and this is not our culture, we want less of this, right? We can use artwork as an indicator as to how stable a community is, depending on the diversity of it, and depending on the vibrance of that artwork, right? Is it highly detailed? Is it simplistic in design? And what do those things mean, right? If you have simplistic artwork in a community, as in not super simple, and I don't want to put like a bad connotation to that, but you might have a community that doesn't put a lot of emphasis into the design of artwork. What does that say about that community as far as its ideals and the things that it finds really important? Maybe artwork isn't that important. Maybe there isn't a lot of time to engage in artwork. Artwork itself is a time-consuming activity. So if all of your time is relegated to, let's say, gathering food, gathering resources, are you going to have a lot of time to put into artwork? Or do you live in a community that doesn't have a place to put a lot of artwork? What if you live in a community that's fairly impoverished and your home isn't set up for holding a lot of artwork? Are you going to see a lot of it being displayed? And all of that can sort of give you that indicator of what is going on within that community. If you go into a home and there isn't a lot of artwork, you might be able to say, okay, well, this community might be having some issues. And that's part of what an anthropologist is going to look for, is the absence of art. You go into some place and you look around and there's no art, is that something that's really important to look for? Anthropology and research, especially ethnographic research, is not only looking for what's there, but looking for what isn't there and trying to understand why it might be missing, whether there is an emphasis on artwork, and who has access to it, who is consuming it, right? And what it means to possess it. So these things can have huge implications on understanding that community. We can understand how one culture might relate to another, whether or not there are shared types of artwork from one community to the next. If they share similar types of artwork, there's a good chance that there is a positive relationship between those two communities. Because if they have the same sort of norms and ideals about the things that they display and consume, that there's likelihood that there's going to be a positive relationship between those communities. If, however, you have two communities, two neighboring communities, and their artwork is distinctly different, or that one community that, say, puts that art from this community into, like, say, a museum, turns it into primitive art, do you think those communities are going to have a positive relationship? And the likelihood is that it's probably not as positive as it could be, or if it's positive at all. So, and that's the other thing too, is that, when we look at the global side, art is consumed in different ways and can be seen as either good or bad, depending on that culture. And then also within, like, Western culture, again, even the concept of fine art and popular art and primitive art, we have created a hierarchy, right? And there might be other cultures out there that don't have that hierarchy when it comes to their art and their design, right? We do it because how we organize our world through our mental maps, right? How we organize things, we oftentimes have to use a hierarchy to, discern what is important and what is less important and unimportant, right? And so how we organize that, and that's that self-reflective aspect that we have to kind of understand. It's like, okay, this is important for us, as a culture. This is as an individual. This is the stuff that I've been brought up to understand, and that when I go into another culture and I view their artwork, that my own bias, my own understanding is going to put it into these categories, and that's going to help me understand, and it'll help the people that are from my own culture to help understand as well. But it might not necessarily be the same sort of hierarchical existence for that community, right? You might go to a community where religious art isn't as appreciated as other cultures. While religion might be just as important, right, it might not have the same impact. So, that's one of the things that we have to try and understand, is how those differences might manifest as we're doing our research. Art has a huge impact when it's consumed on a global scale. One of the things that I want you to think about, okay, is how we consume art. Now, let's just say that, and I'll use some of my own experience from this. Let's just say I go to Kenya, okay? I go to Kenya and I go into this art shop, right? This gallery, and inside of this place, there are a whole bunch of elephants, like carved elephants, and a whole bunch of carved giraffes. And I really like elephants, right? Elephants are super cool. And I'm like, you know what? I know a lot of people back in the United States that also really like elephants, more so than giraffes. Like, giraffes are cool, but elephants, super cool. And so, listen, I'm going to set up this deal with you, and I'm going to talk to this shop owner, this artisan, and I'm going to say, hey, I want to buy a whole bunch of elephants and I want to ship them back to the United States and I want to sell them and I'm going to make you some money, right? I'm going to send you a bunch of cash and you're going to make a bunch of elephants. And all of a sudden, right, I now have this contact and they are making a bunch of elephants and they're sending me these elephants. And the more that of these elephants that I get, the better they become. Because this artisan is making a lot more elephants. And maybe he hires on somebody else to make more elephants. So these elephants become really good. But those giraffes, the giraffes that, sold okay and they were pretty decent looking, they're not being made as often as they used to be, right? And so the artisan doesn't put as much emphasis into those giraffes. And the giraffes become less pretty, right? They're not nearly as cool as these elephants. And so now, as an American, I've gone over to another country, said, I want to buy a whole bunch of elephants, and I've now changed how this artisan and this community is now emphasizing their artwork, how they are producing their artwork, how they are focusing their artwork because of consumption in another country across the world, right? So this is where consumerism on a global scale can have a huge impact on local communities, right? Because of consumption, right? What do we find interesting as a community here might be very different from over there, but then all of a sudden, because we're consuming, right, we want more elephants, the giraffes get no love. So how we consume art, right? How we engage in artwork can change other countries and how they perceive art, right? One of the things that I'm going to mention is that, we have in the United States, in California, we have Hollywood, right? Everybody knows Hollywood, right? Everybody knows what Hollywood does, right? They put out movies. They've got huge budgets. They've got superstars, and they're producing all kinds of amazing things. But if you go to India and you go to Bollywood, right? Bollywood, playing off of Hollywood. If we look at what Bollywood is doing compared to Hollywood, they're producing like 2 to 3 times as many movies as Hollywood is, right? They are producing movies at a massive rate. But because there is that cultural hegemony, while Hollywood isn't necessarily producing better movies, right? They are still producing movies that are consumed more, right? And consumed in more places. Now, as Bollywood grows and their movies start coming into other countries, we might see that change, right? Because those movies are going to have a bigger impact in that area. And we might see a shift of the cultural influence coming from Hollywood start to slacken a little bit. Because now there's a competitor, right? A cultural competitor. And then going back to the example with, let's say, the elephants and the giraffes, right? So I buy this elephant and I'm like, this elephant came from Africa, right? And so it becomes sort of this, not necessarily fine art, right? We've got this hierarchy. It's not publicly consumed, right? It came from this little old artisan. It then oftentimes is considered to be and treated as like primitive art, right? Again, it's this consumption and how we view that artwork, right? It's of an elephant, right? It's not some beautiful painting that we see in the museum or the art gallery, right? That's 200 years old, made by some white dude in France, right? Because that's fine art. That's we've established that Western cultural idealism. No, it's coming from this little shop and this little artisan that's making this, and we treat it differently. We consume it differently. And so we can have this impact, on how art is consumed and created in different places by, if we buy this art, and it can shape an economy and an idealism in another country, in another community. All of a sudden, we see somebody that's doing really well. They're producing a bunch of elephants to be sent over to the United States, and then all of a sudden, they're hiring people to make more elephants. And then one of the competing, shop owners and competing artisans is like, well, if they're making elephants and doing really well, and I'm making giraffes but not doing so well, maybe I should shift over to elephants, and then I can become competitive. And then me as business owner goes over and says, hey, I really like your elephants too. I think I'd like to buy some of your elephants as well. And then all of a sudden, I might not buy as much from this person who has been making all of these elephants. What does that do to the economy? Right? What does that do to a community that might not have been so specialized, might have had more diverse stuff going on, but now is starting to narrow? And then what happens when that market, sort of explodes and becomes everyone starts producing elephants and nobody is producing giraffes? What happens? So we can understand, how art can have an impact on a community that produces art, So, and what kind of impacts it can have on a global scale. Art and power. Art can be an expression of identity. Okay, and what does that mean? Well, if all over the place I see this particular artwork, and it's the popular artwork, it's the stuff that everybody here consumes, then it's likely that has some aspect of identity with me, right? I share that because I am a public consumer, right? I am consuming this. And so there's a good chance that art is representative of me. It is also a representation of the dominant culture. If your art isn't there, right? If your style and your ideas and your culture is not displayed, then you are in the minority, right? Then you are not being represented, and however that looks. If we look at marketing, right? If we look at marketing and we look at what's changed in the last, even like 10 years, if you were to turn on the TV and flip through the commercials, most of the commercials that you would see would have white people in those commercials. So that's an indicator of what the majority, the popular consumption, is being exposed to. Now we've seen this change as we become more aware and more understanding and more appreciative of diversity, that we are having more and more people of color getting into commercials and TV shows and all of these different things and being more represented within our communities, right? And so that power shift is starting to dramatically change. And when we see that kind of stuff, we can also start to infer that there are other things that are being changed within the culture as well. That if we see a diversity of artwork that's being expressed, then we can sort of start to anticipate that in general, there's going to be more diversity that is acceptable within that population. And so that's very much the case with like the United States. As we become more diversely representative, we are starting to see that diversity is becoming more and more of an important aspect of our community in general. If that were not the case, we would see just, certainly in the United States, white people everywhere, which we still kind of do, right? And that's where, when we see media, we can also see that these expressions, how this artwork is displayed, can reinforce either intentionally or unintentionally different ideals within a community, right? So it can become more so. The more stuff that we see on this, the more and more it has an impact on us, either consciously or subconsciously. Let's see. When we look at art inside of a community, and we see what is collected, what is shared, we can start to see those changes, right? So one of the things that ends up happening is that we try and express our art, right, as a community. Now, because art is so influential and oftentimes done so in a subconscious way, it's like why we see Coca-Cola all over the place. It's not only, a conscious decision to go out there and buy Coca-Cola, right? It's like, hey, buy Coke, right? This is what we're trying to tell you. But when you walk into the grocery store and you're going down the aisle and you see you've got Coke right here, you've got Pepsi right here, and then right next to it is RC Cola, right? I don't know if any of you have ever had like RC Cola or Shasta. I don't know if you've ever had Shasta Cola. If you've ever been in the Northwest, you've probably seen it. And I think every once in a while here in Colorado, you can find Shasta as well. But it's one of those little known colas. But it doesn't have the name recognition, right? Doesn't have the name recognition. So right next to Coca-Cola, you find RC Cola. And personally, I like them both the same, right? I don't think there's any difference. I mean, the flavoring is a little bit different, but I don't really find one particularly more appealing than the other. But this is what I do know. I do know that Coca-Cola is everywhere, and everybody likes Coca-Cola. So maybe I trust Coca-Cola more. Maybe I'm going to buy more Coca-Cola than RC Cola, even though they are equally fine. I have been influenced enough and told that, guess what? Coca-Cola is trustworthy, right? And there's other types of advertisements that do that as well, right? Again, going back to like the Obama poster, right? You got Obama and then hope, right? Hope is right across the bottom. And hope gives us trust, right? I trust in that. What about Make America Great Again? Those words right there, as far as an advertisement, they actually sound great, right? That's Make America Great Again. You know, me personally, I question, you know, what time are we talking about being great again? But for the people that support Trump, they see this red hat as his advertisement. And we are talking about making America a wonderful place, a place where our values are important, you know, and it becomes this advertisement. Very simple. Everybody wears one, right? If you go to a Trump rally, it's a sea of red hats, right? And that's art. That is the consumption of an artistic expression, right? Wearing that clothing, wearing that that hat gives you identity, and that identity is very important, right? Whether or not you believe in what is being said doesn't matter. What's important is that you are a part of this movement and that you have shared ideals. And so that's why when it comes to sort of expression and power, things like the Hope poster or the red hat, right, become indicative of an idea. And, you know, and can have a massive influence on a community, whether or not you subscribe to these ideas, you know, and can influence and reinforce. You know, you might wear that red hat and say, you know, these are my values, and some of the things that Trump does, I don't really like. He's not a very kind individual, right? But he still supports some of my ideals. And so when I put that red hat on and I see all these other red hats, I'm like, oh, well, you know, maybe it's okay because I'm a part of this community, right? It reinforces these ideals that might not necessarily always be shared, but are enough, right? There's enough of it there that can influence and have that bigger impact. So you can have these different ideas that are important to look at and to see what kind of an impact they're going to have on that community. And those red hats will become forever known to be associated with Trump and his presidency. And what happens to people that don't agree with Trump? Will they ever buy another red hat? Probably not, right? Probably not. If you don't like Trump, the likelihood of you ever buying another red hat is pretty slim because that red is associated with that ideology. So, you know, even just basic color schemes can have a huge impact on what sort of ideology you might have. I mean, we already understand this in a certain aspect from even our politics, right? Red and blue states, right? How we depict these, we use these icons, you know, elephants for the Republicans and donkeys for the Democrats. And so we have these different ideas that are continually used and reinforced to sort of assign an idealism to and something that we find important. So, you know, when we look at these different things, right, we have to understand that they do have a major impact consciously and subconsciously. And that over time, those things can become reinforced even more so, or lose their power. So in 20 years, after Trump is gone as a president, and he's probably dead at that point in 20 years, will red hats come back in style? Maybe. Maybe they will. We also need to talk about globalism more, and how it's sort of changed, right? How we consume media. So actually, you know what we're going to do? We're going to pause. This will be the end of this video, and we will start again here in just a minute with another video, because I'm sure I'm going to ramble on some more, and you might need a break. So I'll go ahead and stop. We'll see you in a few minutes.